Picture a narrow road outside Haarlem, Netherlands in 1943, right in the middle of World War II. A young woman pedals a bicycle like she is running errands, like she is any ordinary girl on any ordinary day. An SS officer sees her and follows, thinking he has found a little escape, an easy laugh, a harmless chat. She turns onto a canal path, slows down, glances back, and gives him a quick smile. That is the innocent bicycle tactic that lured SS officers to their death. That is exactly how it happened in the Second World War. Her name is Truus Oversteegen. She is the older sister, the cool head of the Oversteegen sisters, and the one who could keep her nerves steady when bullets were flying. Her sister is Freddie Oversteegen, younger, quick, and fearless. These were not girls the way the Nazis imagined. They were female resistance fighters, and they hunted with patience. If you have ever watched WWII Documentaries or read military history, you might have missed them because this is forgotten history, and in a historical biography of women in war, their names still hit like a hammer. Let me tell you how this worked, because in the Dutch resistance and the underground resistance, you fought the enemy with whatever you had. The bicycle tactic was simple. Truus Oversteegen would use a calm smile and a gentle voice to get close to an SS officer, and then the moment would flip. 1 minute he thinks he is in charge. Then he is off the road, deeper into the trees. Then he is staring down the barrel of a pistol. This is not a rumor. This is World War II, and it was real. Those quiet paths outside Haarlem were battlefields of urban warfare, just without the tanks and the headlines. Now, fellas, you and I know what war does to a man. It breaks the world down to hard choices. You either look away or you stand up. Truus Oversteegen stood up. She and Freddie Oversteegen, the Oversteegen sisters, were pulled into the Dutch resistance by a mother who believed in sacrifice and an underground resistance that needed brave hands. You can call it whatever you want, SOE Tactics or Assassination Tactics. In plain talk, they were Nazi hunters who did the job no one else could. Before we get deeper, let me ask you a favor, man to man. If you care about World War II, if you care about the Dutch resistance and keeping this forgotten history alive, tap like and subscribe. It tells the folks in charge that military history still matters to you. A quick like or a subscription tells the system that stories like the Oversteegen sisters belong in the spotlight. Truus Oversteegen was born in 1923, a couple of years before Freddie Oversteegen. Their mother, Treintje, called Truus and Freddie her little soldiers. Their father drifted away, and the family lived poor, sometimes on a houseboat, sometimes in a cramped flat in Haarlem. It was a rough life in the years before the Second World War, the kind of life where you learn to share a single blanket and still make room for somebody in trouble. Truus Oversteegen learned early that being tough did not mean being cruel. That lesson would keep her human even when she carried a pistol. Their mother was a committed communist, but the real lesson she taught the girls was not politics, it was responsibility. If you see injustice, you do not pretend it is not there. You get involved. She hid people. She fed refugees. She welcomed strangers as if they were family. That was the early schooling of Truus Oversteegen, and that is why in World War II she did not hesitate. When the Dutch resistance needed help, the Oversteegen sisters were already halfway in the fight. In May of 1940, the Germans rolled into the Netherlands, and the air changed overnight. You could feel it in the streets, in the new rules, in the way people kept their voices low. That is how the Second World War felt in a small town. The Dutch resistance was still a handful of people whispering in back rooms. The underground resistance was not a machine yet. It was people taking risks, passing notes, and hiding neighbors. Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen started with the simplest jobs because those were the jobs that held the line. They posted anti-Nazi leaflets at night. They glued messages over German posters. They slipped warnings into mailboxes. They told young men not to go work for the German war machine. That sounds small, but it was not. In WWII history, small acts are the seeds of big ones. This was World War II, and every poster was a strike against the occupation. For female resistance fighters, for women in war, that early work was training, a lesson in nerves and timing and keeping your head down. It did not take long for the underground resistance to hear about them. A local organizer came to the family door, a man who ran a cell of the Dutch resistance. He had heard about the sisters who rode their bicycles at night, about the mother who hid Jewish families. He asked for a meeting. He looked Truus Oversteegen in the eye and asked if she and Freddie Oversteegen were ready for real work. They said yes. He said he needed to be sure. A few days later he came back with a pistol and a costume, pretending to be a German officer. He slammed the door, shouted in German, demanded names. It was a test. Truus Oversteegen did not flinch. Freddie Oversteegen threw herself at him. They fought, kicked, and screamed because they believed they were protecting a hidden man. The organizer stopped, laughed, and told them the truth. They had passed. That was the moment the Oversteegen sisters crossed the line from helpers to fighters, from sympathizers to female resistance fighters. He told them what it would mean. It meant learning SOE Tactics and Assassination Tactics without ever calling them that. It meant learning how to use a pistol in a dark cellar. It meant being the kind of WWII secret agents who could slip through streets filled with German patrols. It meant living with danger every day. Truus Oversteegen listened, and she nodded. She had already made up her mind. In World War II, the Dutch resistance did not wait for permission. They acted. The training was in a cold, underground potato cellar. The smell of dirt, the squeeze of the space, the weight of a gun in a teenage hand. That is how it started. Truus Oversteegen learned to breathe slowly. She learned to keep her eyes steady. She learned that fear does not go away. You just put it in your back pocket and work anyway. If you think about WWII secret agents, you picture trench coats and coded radios. In WWII history, sometimes it is just a girl in a cellar becoming a Nazi hunter because no one else is going to do it. Their first real job was sabotage, not murder. A warehouse full of German supplies needed to burn, but it was guarded by armed men. Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen were told to walk up, smile, and talk. Just two girls on bicycles, nothing to see. The guards chatted, the sisters laughed, and behind them the underground resistance slipped in with kerosene and matches. This is how the Dutch resistance worked, a mix of boldness and calm. 1 minute, small talk. Then flames. Then smoke. That is World War II, and it is also urban warfare in its own quiet way. When they saw that the sisters could pull it off, the resistance leaders gave them darker assignments. There were Dutch collaborators who had betrayed their neighbors. There were men who collected names and addresses for the Germans. There were officers who walked the streets like they owned them. Truus Oversteegen was told to stop them. She understood what that meant. She was about to become a real Nazi hunter, a young woman using assassination tactics in the name of the Dutch resistance, the underground resistance, and the Allied operations that were slowly turning the tide. If you are listening to this as a student of military history, you know there is a difference between a soldier and a killer. Truus Oversteegen wanted to remain a soldier. Her mother told her to stay human. That line matters in World War II because the enemy had thrown humanity away. The Oversteegen sisters tried to keep it. That is part of why their story is so powerful, and why it belongs in every honest conversation about women in war. So now, with that in mind, let us walk into the heart of the story, the bicycle tactic itself, and the cold mind of Truus Oversteegen, the older sister who kept the team steady. This is where the Dutch resistance used the streets as their battlefield. This is where the underground resistance turned bicycles into weapons. This is where World War II became personal. The bicycle tactic that made the German officers lower their guard was built on patience and on a deep knowledge of human nature. Truus Oversteegen understood that in World War II, power makes a man careless. She would ride past a barracks or a checkpoint, look like a harmless teenager, and give a polite nod. The officer would see a girl, not a threat. Then she would slow down, let him catch up, and let him believe the road was his. That is the heart of assassination tactics in the Dutch resistance, and it is a classic example of SOE tactics without the paperwork. This is how WWII secret agents operated in the underground resistance, in plain sight, in the middle of urban warfare. The innocent part of the bicycle tactic was the costume of normal life. A basket on the handlebars, a small scarf, a smile. The deadly part was that she had already arranged the ground, a patch of woods, a turn in the path, a friend waiting with a gun, and a shallow ditch for a body. Truus Oversteegen could do this because she had scouted the route for days, because she had counted the steps, because she had lined up the escape. That is a detail you hear in military history when the story is told right, and it is the detail that gets lost in WWII documentaries that rush past the grit. One of the first bicycle jobs Truus Oversteegen took was against a Dutch collaborator who liked to drink at a local tavern and brag about his Nazi friends. The Dutch resistance had proof he was feeding names to the occupiers. She went in, sat at the counter, and let him talk. He offered to walk her home, and she said yes. That was the invitation. They went down a narrow canal path. She kept the pace easy. He got comfortable. Then the path bent. Then the other sister stepped out. That is the this happens, but then this rhythm of the underground resistance. In the Second World War, you could be laughing with a man 1 minute and burying him the next. Truus Oversteegen did what she had to do, and she carried the weight for the rest of her life. There is a hard truth in WWII history and in every honest historical biography of women in war. The first time you pull a trigger on a human being, your body does not forget. Truus Oversteegen said later that the natural instinct was to help the person you just shot, to kneel down, to cradle them. That is why her mother told her to stay human. Truus Oversteegen did stay human, even as a Nazi hunter in the Dutch resistance. She cried after some of the missions. She remembered faces. In World War II, the Second World War, that is the price of choosing to be a female resistance fighter, a burden that WWII II. Documentaries and military history books rarely capture with this level of honesty. The bicycle tactic was not always a lure into the forest. Sometimes Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen rode fast, 2 on a bike, 1 pedaling, 1 holding the pistol. They would pass a target on the street, close enough for a clean shot, and then they would keep going. No dramatic chase, no Hollywood, just speed and silence. Those were assassination tactics, the kind of urban warfare that turns a city into a maze. In the Dutch resistance and the underground resistance, a bicycle was quieter than a car and easier to hide. Other times the tactic was a knock at the door. Truus Oversteegen would learn a routine, learn a name, and then knock at the front door like a neighbor. The target would open it and see a young woman and think he was safe. That brief moment was the whole gap. That was the trap. That was WWII. Secret agents' work, And if you call it SOE Tactics, you would not be wrong. In World War II, there were no clean lines. There was only the work. If this story hits you in the gut, that is because it should. It is easy to look at a map and call it a campaign. It is harder to picture a teenager on a bicycle using assassination tactics in the Dutch resistance. That is why this is forgotten history, and why military history needs to keep telling it. If you are still with me and you want more of this kind of WWII history and Second World War storytelling, I would be grateful if you hit like and subscribe. It helps a lot of people find these historical biography stories of women in war, and it keeps WWII Documentaries honest with the details they sometimes leave out. Now, when Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen took on a mission, they would often recon the area as if they were running errands. A loop around the market, a pause by the bridge, a slow ride past the train station. They were blending in. That is what WWII secret agents do in the underground resistance. Then, when the moment came, they acted fast. That combination of calm and violence is what made them so effective. It is also why the Oversteegen sisters became the quiet backbone of the Dutch resistance in that region of the Netherlands. In World War II, small circles of women could move like ghosts, and the Nazi hunters among them knew how to vanish. The Dutch resistance was not a single army with uniforms and ranks. It was a patchwork. Some were printers, some were farmers, some were clergy, and some were teenagers on bicycles. The underground resistance used a handful of tactics, and the Oversteegen sisters learned them all. They stole ration cards, they moved fugitives at night, they carried messages in their bike frames. They also gathered information on German patrols, which fed into Allied operations. That is why you will sometimes hear their methods described as SOE Tactics. It was the same logic, just done in kitchen rooms and cold barns instead of offices. Truus Oversteegen kept a small notebook of routes, not because she wanted to write, but because the brain needs a map when fear is high. She knew which bridges were watched, which streets were blocked, which alleys gave you a clean escape. That is urban warfare at its most basic, a map in your head and a willingness to act. In the Second World War, the streets of Haarlem and the villages nearby were not just streets. They were the chessboard of the Dutch resistance, and the Oversteegen sisters were a quiet set of queens moving in the dark. Sometimes the work was not violent at all. One day they were told to escort a Jewish child across town. The next day, they were told to move a downed Allied pilot to a safe house. Truus Oversteegen would change her clothes, carry a basket, and walk as if she was going to the market. That was the cover. That was how WWII secret agents in the underground resistance moved people under the nose of the Germans. This is the kind of detail you only hear in a good historical biography, and it is what makes the story of women in war so hard to ignore. Then the pressure would swing back. One night you are hiding a child. The next night you are handed a pistol and a name. The "this happens, but then this" rhythm never stopped. Truus Oversteegen grew into that rhythm. She could go from a soft voice to a cold stare in a heartbeat. That is why she was the older sister, the anchor of the Oversteegen sisters. Freddie Oversteegen could be the spark. Truus Oversteegen was the steady flame. Both were female resistance fighters. Both were Nazi hunters when the order came down. The German occupiers knew that the Dutch resistance was there, but they could not see its edges. That was the power of the underground resistance. It was spread out and small, like a network of roots. The Germans were used to meeting an enemy on a battlefield. They were not used to fighting the barber, the baker, or the girl on a bicycle. In World War II, those small, hidden networks made the difference. That is the side of WWII history that can feel invisible if you only read about big battles. As the war ground on, the Dutch resistance learned to coordinate with Allied operations more directly. Radios appeared, coded messages were passed, and the work got sharper. The Oversteegen sisters did not sit behind a radio, but their missions were part of the flow. A bridge blows up so a train cannot move, and somewhere down the line an Allied operations planner adjusts a map. A set of papers disappears, and a German patrol goes in the wrong direction. That is how SOE Tactics and Assassination Tactics meet on the ground in World War II. For Truus Oversteegen, every mission carried a weight. She was not blind to the danger. The Germans executed people for less. She saw empty chairs in neighbors' kitchens. She saw the boots and the trucks. She also saw the resolve in the eyes of people who kept fighting. That is the heart of the Dutch resistance, the underground resistance, and the reason this is not just forgotten history. It is a story of ordinary people making impossible choices in the Second World War. In the wider military history of the occupation, the Oversteegen sisters are a small unit, but small units change the course of lives, and sometimes that is the only course that matters. This is why WWII documentaries that focus only on generals miss the point. It is also why a proper historical biography of women in war needs to show the grit in their hands and the fear in their throats. Truus Oversteegen was not a figure on a map. She was a person who had to decide, day after day, what she could live with. By 1943, the German grip was getting tighter, and the need for action was sharper. That was the year the Dutch resistance brought in another young fighter who would become part of the story. Her name was Hannie Schaft. She came from a different background, she looked different, but the fire in her was the same. She would become one of the most famous female resistance fighters of the Second World War, a key figure in WWII history whose story belongs in every military history discussion. Her path would cross with Truus Oversteegen in a way that would change both of them, creating one of the most effective teams of WWII secret agents in the underground resistance. Hannie Schaft was born in 1920 and studied law in Amsterdam. Her family was middle class, and she had a future that had nothing to do with guns. Then the Germans demanded that students sign a loyalty statement to the occupiers. Hannie Schaft refused. That was the pivot. She did not go back to class. She went into the Dutch resistance. In the language of WWII history, that refusal was her point of no return. In the language of a historical biography, it is the moment she chose to be a woman in war. When Hannie Schaft first met the Oversteegen sisters, she was younger in spirit, older in years, and different in style. Truus Oversteegen was street-smart and steady. Freddie Oversteegen was quick and bold. Hannie Schaft was thoughtful and intense. She had bright hair and a face you remembered, which was a problem in an underground resistance. Still, the leaders needed her, and she needed them. The three of them formed a triangle: Truus Oversteegen as the anchor, Freddie Oversteegen as the scout, and Hannie Schaft as the planner. In military history, that kind of balance is gold, and in the Dutch resistance it was deadly. Hannie Schaft was tested the same way the sisters had been tested, with a gun and a target. The gun was unloaded. The point was to see if she would pull the trigger. She did. That was the initiation. She became part of the cell. From that day forward, the trio moved as WWII secret agents, using SOE Tactics and Assassination Tactics with a focus that makes even a hardened Nazi hunter feel the cold. This was the Oversteegen sisters plus Hannie Schaft, and it was a small storm in the middle of the Second World War. The work expanded across every front of the Dutch resistance. They did more sabotage. They cut telephone wires. They ruined rail lines. They stole identity cards. They helped Jewish families cross into safer territory. They passed intelligence to Allied operations, acting as WWII secret agents on the ground. One minute they were moving a child, the next they were stalking a collaborator using the same assassination tactics that made them feared Nazi hunters. That is urban warfare in the Dutch resistance and the underground resistance, a fast shift from soft to hard, from quiet to loud. It is also why stories about women in war in World War II have to include the full range, the tenderness and the violence side by side. Truus Oversteegen often took the lead in selecting routes and planning exits. Freddie Oversteegen had a feel for the streets and could sense danger before it arrived. Hannie Schaft could read people, could hear a lie in a voice, could pick the right moment to move. Together, they were more than a team. They were a weapon. In World War II, you did not need a tank if you could put a pistol in the right place at the right time. That is the ugly truth of assassination tactics. Their missions made them the stuff of whispered stories. The local German soldiers thought the Dutch resistance was a gang of men. They were wrong. It was women. It was students. It was bakers and schoolteachers. The Oversteegen sisters, Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen, along with Hannie Schaft, were proof that female resistance fighters could strike at the heart of the occupation. In WWII Documentaries, that fact is often a footnote. In the real WWII history, it is central. The trio were careful, but war is never clean. There were close calls. There were near arrests. There were nights when they hid in basements with nothing but the sound of boots outside. That is part of the underground resistance, the constant tension. It is also part of the mental cost, a cost that military history sometimes ignores. Truus Oversteegen would later say that she could never sleep well again. The Second World War stayed with her long after the guns went quiet. If you are halfway through this and you feel like this story is different, it is. It is not a parade story. It is a ground story. If you are getting value out of this and you want more, subscribe and hit that like button. It keeps this channel alive, and it helps these stories of World War II, WWII history, and women in war reach people who still care about the truth. Let me take you into one mission that shows how the bicycle tactic worked in real time. There was a German SS officer who ran a small unit that had been brutalizing families on the outskirts of Haarlem. The Dutch resistance wanted him gone. Truus Oversteegen was assigned to lure him away from his men. She rode past the checkpoint in a gray coat, looked down, and let him see just enough of her face to make him curious. He followed. She took a side road, then another. He asked her name. She said the first name that came to her mind. He smiled. That is how it begins. In World War II, in WWII history, in the Second World War, people fell for the ordinary because the ordinary was all they had left. She led him to a wooded path by a canal. The officer relaxed. He was already thinking of the end of his shift, the drink in his hand. Then a shadow moved. Freddie Oversteegen stepped out, calm and steady. Truus Oversteegen turned, her hand in her bag. The officer understood in a flash. He went for his sidearm. He was too late. One shot, quick and clean. The two sisters dropped his body into the ditch. They had prepared, covered it with reeds, and rode away on the same bicycle. That is urban warfare. That is assassination tactics. That is the Dutch resistance in action. Afterward, Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen did not celebrate. They walked the bicycle back to the safe house with their heads down. They washed their hands. They said very little. The underground resistance had given the order, and they had done the job, but the weight was still there. This is not a video game. This is not a fantasy. This is women in war, the kind that leaves a mark on your soul. The older men listening to this know that truth. You never forget the moments when a life ends by your hand. The bicycle tactic was so effective because it played on routine. German officers were bored. They were far from home, and they wanted a moment of normal life. The Oversteegen sisters knew it. That is why in military history you will sometimes hear them described as "Bau secret agents." It is not just about guns and bombs. It is about reading people, about understanding a man in uniform the same way a poker player reads a face. Truus Oversteegen was good at that. She did not enjoy it, but she was good at it. As the months rolled on, the targets changed. The sisters went after collaborators, informers, and Dutch SS recruits who hurt their neighbors. Truus Oversteegen said later that those were the hardest. It is one thing to shoot an occupying officer. It is another to shoot a neighbor who betrayed his own town. But in the Dutch resistance, they saw those men as cancer in the body, and the only way to save the body was to cut it out. It was the worst kind of assassination tactics, but it was the one they believed was necessary. That is the grim side of WWII history, and it is why this is forgotten history. People want a clean story, but war is not clean. There was one mission that the resistance leadership wanted them to take, and it was the one they refused. A high Nazi official had family in the Netherlands, and the order came down to kidnap his children as leverage. If he did not comply, the children would be killed. Truus Oversteegen said no. Freddie Oversteegen said no. Hannie Schaft said no. They would kill soldiers, they would kill collaborators, but they would not kill children. That line mattered. In the Second World War, it was a line that kept them from becoming the enemy they fought. It was the moral spine of the Oversteegen sisters, and it is part of why this is a historical biography worth telling. Truus Oversteegen would never forget a scene she witnessed in the street. A Dutch SS man grabbed a baby from a mother and smashed the child against a wall. It was a brutal act, done to spread terror. Truus Oversteegen pulled her pistol and shot him on the spot. It was not an order. It was not a mission. It was just a human response to evil. That moment explains everything about her. She was a Nazi hunter because she could not look away. She was a female. Resistance fighter because she believed that staying human meant acting when others would freeze. Around the same time, Hannie Schaft became one of the most wanted people in the region. Her red hair was famous. The Germans put out notices. She dyed it dark and wore glasses, but the risk never went away. The underground resistance moved her between safe houses. She kept working because she could not stop. In World War II, that is how the best WWII secret agents behaved. They were not thrill-seekers. They were committed, and they knew that if they stopped, someone else would die. The work of the trio cut across lines. They blew up rails to delay deportation trains. They stole weapons from German supply points. They sabotaged trucks. They gathered intel for Allied operations. That is the broad view of their role in military history, but the daily life was smaller and more dangerous. It was whispers in kitchens, notes in pockets, bicycles leaning against a wall. It was the Dutch, resistance in real time, the underground resistance in its most human form. It was World War II lived minute by minute. If you are still tracking with me, this is the point where the pressure starts to rise. The Germans were losing on the big fronts, and that made them more brutal at home. They hunted the underground resistance harder. They searched homes more often. They cracked down on anyone who looked out of place. This is when every ride on a bicycle felt like it might be the last. If you have been in a tight spot yourself, you know that feeling in your chest, that squeeze. Truus Oversteegen lived with that squeeze every day. The Germans were not blind. They started connecting dots. They picked up a wounded resistance fighter who had worked with Hannie Schaft. He was dying in a hospital, and a German officer posed as a friend. The man, foggy with pain, gave up a name and an address. That is how war twists things. One minute you are fighting, then you are bleeding, then someone you do not recognize asks a question, and the answer slips out. That is how the underground resistance gets cracked, one small leak at a time. The Germans raided the house they were given. Hannie Schaft was not there, but her parents were. The Nazis arrested them and sent them away. Hannie Schaft went deeper underground, and the Oversteegen sisters did what they could to protect her. Truus Oversteegen understood the risk. If Hannie was captured, the whole network could be exposed. The Dutch resistance moved safe houses like chess pieces. That is the constant, this happens, but then this rhythm. Safe house, raid, rescue, retaliation. It was a war inside a war. There is a point in the Second World War when you can feel the end coming, but you are still in danger. Early 1945 was that point in the Netherlands. Allied operations were closing in. The Germans were pulling back. But the streets were still deadly. The underground resistance kept working because until the last soldier left, the occupation remained. Truus Oversteegen kept cycling. Freddie Oversteegen kept scouting. Hannie Schaft, in hiding, kept carrying papers and a pistol in her bag. Then, on a cold day in March 1945, Hannie Schaft was stopped at a checkpoint in Haarlem. She was carrying an illegal newspaper and a small gun. The Germans searched her bag and found everything. She was arrested on the spot. They took her to prison. They interrogated her. They beat her. They tried to get names. She gave them nothing. She admitted the actions she had taken, but did not betray the Oversteegen sisters or the Dutch resistance. That is why she remains one of the most respected female resistance fighters in WWII history. For weeks, the Germans were not sure they had the red-haired resistance leader. Hannie Schaft had dyed her hair dark, but her roots began to show. That is how they confirmed it. It is a small detail, but it matters in a historical biography. It is one of those tiny moments that turns a person into a symbol. Hannie Schaft became the symbol of the Dutch resistance in the last months of World War II. The Germans decided to kill her. There was supposed to be an agreement to stop executions, but the officers on the ground ignored it. In April 1945, just weeks before liberation, Hannie Schaft was taken to the dunes outside the city. She was shot by collaborators, not by Germans, and she died at the edge of the sand. Before she died, she looked at the man who missed his first shot and said that she shot better than he did. That line has echoed through the military history of the Netherlands ever since. Let me pause right here for a quick second. If you want more of these deep dives into World War II, and you want to help keep forgotten history alive, go ahead and hit like and subscribe. It tells the system that military history and stories of women in war matter. It helps me keep bringing you these stories with the details the documentaries leave out. Truus Oversteegen heard the news and carried it silently. She did not cry in public. She did not talk about it much. She kept working until the war was over. That is what a Nazi hunter does when the job is not finished. That is what a woman in war does when the line between life and death is paper thin. The Oversteegen sisters knew that Hannie Schaft had died so that others could live. They did not forget her. They never would. When the Germans finally surrendered in May 1945, the Netherlands erupted in celebration, but the joy was mixed with grief. The Dutch resistance had lost thousands. The underground resistance had buried too many friends. In World War II and the Second World War, victory always comes with a price. The bodies in the dunes were a quiet, terrible ledger. Hannie Schaft was buried among hundreds of resistance fighters. She was the only woman in that mass grave, and her red hair was still visible in the sand. For Truus Oversteegen, the end of the war did not mean the end of the struggle. She had survived, but she carried the images, the sound of shots, the fear of footsteps in a stairwell. That is the hidden cost of WWII history that military history sometimes skips. You can win a war and still lose your sleep. Freddie Oversteegen and Truus Oversteegen tried to build a normal life, but the past stayed close. Truus Oversteegen turned to art. She became a sculptor, and she made monuments to the Dutch resistance. In a way, she kept fighting by making people remember. The Oversteegen sisters were not celebrated right away. In the early Cold War, their communist ties made the government uneasy. They were honored in whispers, not in parades. This is one of those uncomfortable parts of forgotten history. The same country they saved kept them at arm's length. Truus Oversteegen kept her head down. Freddie Oversteegen raised a family and tried to forget the smell of gun oil. Hannie Schaft was given a state funeral, and rightly so, but the sisters were not given the same respect until many decades later. That is how public memory works, and it is why stories like this belong in WWII Documentaries and historical biography. If you are a man who has watched the world change and you feel like the sacrifices of your generation have been pushed aside, you can probably feel this. Truus Oversteegen lived it. She did the work in World War II in the Dutch resistance, and she waited years for anyone to say thank you. That kind of delay can harden a person. It can also make you more determined to tell the story yourself. That is what she did in interviews and in sculpture in the long aftermath of the Second World War. After the guns fell silent, the Oversteegen sisters tried to step into normal life. Truus Oversteegen had seen too much to ever be normal, but she tried. She married and had a family. Freddie Oversteegen did the same. They both kept quiet about their kills, about their time as female resistance fighters and Nazi hunters in the Dutch resistance. If you asked them how many men they had shot using those assassination tactics, they would say that it was not a question for a soldier. That answer tells you a lot about women in war during the Second World War. They did not see themselves as legends of WWII history. They saw themselves as people who did a job in World War II and then carried the cost, the kind of cost that military history and WWII documentaries often miss. Truus Oversteegen poured her memories into sculpture. She created memorials for the Dutch resistance, for the underground resistance, for the people whose names were never printed in newspapers. If you walk in Haarlem today, you can see her work, and you can feel how it carries the weight of the Second World War. It is physical, it has edges, it has scars, it is like the city itself. That is what art can do when it comes from a person who lived the story instead of just reading about it. Freddie Oversteegen spoke less in public. She was more private, more contained, but she never forgot Hannie Schaft. She visited her grave and left flowers for decades. That is the bond between female resistance fighters, between women in war who shared a war that never really left them. In military history, you can list their missions and their targets. In a historical biography, you can tell their childhood and their end, but in the real world, it is the small acts of remembrance that show who they were. The Dutch government did not recognize the sisters right away. The Cold War turned old allies into suspects. Because of their communist background, Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen were treated as complicated. That is one of those bitter footnotes in WWII history, the kind you do not see in glossy WWII documentaries. The Dutch resistance did not have one political shade, it had many, and the Oversteegen sisters were part of a left-wing circle that made officials nervous. So the public praise came late. It took decades. In 2014, more than 60 years after the Second World War ended, the Dutch Prime Minister finally awarded Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen the Mobilization War Cross. Truus Oversteegen was 91. Freddie Oversteegen was 90. Their son said it was the happiest day of his mother's life. Think about that. You do the work in World War II, and you wait almost your entire life for a thank you. That is why this is forgotten history, and why it matters to tell it right. The memory of these women has grown in recent years. There are books now, and there are more WWII documentaries that mention them. But even now, you can read a long book on military history and never see their names. That is the way history is taught, and it is the reason I put so much emphasis on women in war in this podcast. Truus Oversteegen, Freddie Oversteegen, and Hannie Schaft did not fit the old pattern. They were not on a battlefield in uniform. They were on bicycles, they were in taverns, they were in quiet streets using assassination tactics to protect neighbors. That is a story that deserves to stand next to the bigger stories, not behind them. There is also a lesson in the innocent bicycle tactic itself. It shows that the Dutch resistance used whatever was ordinary to become extraordinary. A bicycle is a simple thing, a tool for kids and working men, a way to get home from a shift. In the Second World War, it became a weapon. Truus Oversteegen made it a tool of urban warfare. She turned it into a way to move fast, to blend in, to get close without raising alarms. If you study SOE Tactics or any guide to WWII secret agents, you will see the same principle. It is not about gadgets, it is about disguise, timing, and nerve. You can also see the moral complexity. The Oversteegen sisters killed, but they refused to kill children. That choice was not easy. It was a line that kept them from becoming what they fought. In World War II, the enemy used fear and cruelty as tools. The Dutch resistance used courage and restraint. That is why the story has weight. It is not just about shooting Nazis. It is about staying human while doing the hardest work. I have read a lot of historical biography in my time, and I can tell you that the best ones do not polish the rough edges. They show the fear. They show the hesitation. They show the nights when a person stares at the ceiling and wonders if the next day will be their last. Truus Oversteegen had those nights. Freddie Oversteegen had those nights. Hannie Schaft had those nights. They were WWII secret agents in the underground resistance, but they were also young women who wanted to live, who wanted to grow old, who wanted to see a world without occupation. If you want to understand the larger map, this is how it fits. The Dutch resistance was one piece of Allied operations. It was a small piece, but it mattered. Sabotage slowed trains. Stolen papers saved lives. Assassination tactics created uncertainty inside the occupying forces. A German officer could not trust a casual conversation anymore. That is the kind of pressure that changes a war from the inside. It is the kind of pressure that makes even a powerful army look over its shoulder. In World War II, those small pressures added up. The Oversteegen sisters were not alone. There were other female resistance fighters, other women in war, in France, in Poland, in the Balkans. But there is something about the Netherlands story, about the bicycle and the canal and the flat fields, that makes it feel close and personal. It feels like a place you can picture. It feels like a story you can walk into. That is why the innocent bicycle tactic lands. It is ordinary and deadly at the same time. When I think about Truus Oversteegen, I think about her calm in the middle of chaos. I think about her refusing to hurt a child. I think about her honoring Hannie Schaft by remembering her. I think about how she chose art after the war because she needed a way to build something after spending years tearing things down. That is the deeper layer of this historical biography. It is about what happens after the Second World War, after the shooting, after the secret missions, when the silence is loud and the memories are sharp. This story is not just about the Oversteegen sisters. It is also about the Dutch resistance as a whole, about the underground resistance that kept a nation alive. It is about WWII secret agents who were not wearing badges, about Nazi hunters who rode bicycles, about SOE tactics that did not need an office to be effective. It is about how a teenager can make a decision in a kitchen and change the course of a neighbor's life. That is the soul of WWII history. If you have ever felt like the world has moved on and left the lessons behind, I get it. A lot of us grew up with fathers and uncles who served, and now we see those stories reduced to a paragraph. This is why I keep saying this is forgotten history. We are not just looking at maps and dates. We are looking at people. We are looking at Truus Oversteegen. We are looking at Freddie Oversteegen. We are looking at Hannie Schaft. We are looking at female resistance fighters who made the world a little safer, one risky mission at a time. And let me be honest with you. There is a reason this story hits men like us. We know what it means to keep your word. We know what it means to protect your family. We know what it means to do a hard job and then go home and act like nothing happened. Truus Oversteegen did that for decades. She did the work in World War II, and then she lived with it. That is something that speaks to the generation that built this country, and it is why these stories should not be left to dusty shelves. This is a good moment for me to say one more thing. If this story is landing with you, and you want to help keep the memory of the Oversteegen sisters alive, now is the time. Subscribe and hit like. It is a simple click, but it helps people find these stories of World War II, WWII history, and women in war that are too often left in the shadows. When we talk about WWII documentaries, we often talk about generals and battles. We talk about tanks and planes. But the truth is that military history is also built on small moves, on a bicycle at dusk, on a quiet nod from a girl who is not a girl at all. That is why I call it the innocent bicycle tactic. It looks soft, but it is sharp. That is why the Oversteegen sisters are a perfect example of women in war, and why the Dutch resistance deserves the same respect as any army. Before I close this out, I want to walk you through the story once more in the rhythm of the people who lived it, because that rhythm matters. This happens, but then this. The Germans invade, but then the Dutch resistance forms. The Oversteegen sisters start with leaflets, but then they are trained in a cellar. The bicycle is a way to get to the market, but then it becomes a weapon. A German officer follows a smiling girl, but then he is led into the trees. This is how World War II felt on the ground, and it is a side of WWII history the books cannot always capture. Truus Oversteegen did not set out to be a killer. She set out to be a decent person. That is a point I want to make clear, because in the Second World War, decency was a choice, not a default. The Dutch resistance was built on that choice. The underground resistance was built on neighbors who refused to be silent. Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen, as the Oversteegen sisters, made that choice again and again. That is the heartbeat of this historical biography, and the reason it belongs in any conversation about women in war. The innocent bicycle tactic itself has layers. On the surface, it is a simple move. A young woman on a bicycle lures an officer away from his men. But underneath, it is about deception, timing, and nerves. It is about reading a room, reading a man, and knowing when to move. That is the work of secret agents, and it is where SOE Tactics and Assassination Tactics meet the street. This is urban warfare done by people who did not have uniforms, and that makes it easy to miss in military history if you are only looking at battles and medals. I also want to highlight the psychological price again. Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen were teenagers when they started. Think about that. Think about the weight of a pistol in a young hand. Think about a life chosen and a life taken in a single second. It is easy to say they were Nazi hunters and move on. It is harder to hold the truth that they were also young women who wanted to live. That is why the phrase "women in war" matters. It is not a slogan, it is a reality that includes fear, courage, regret, and determination all at once. Hannie Schaft is a part of this story not because she was famous, but because she was real. She was a law student who refused to pledge loyalty. She joined the Dutch resistance and became a female resistance fighter in her own right. She moved like a ghost through the underground resistance, dyed her hair, and kept working even when it was dangerous. She was caught, and she died a few weeks before liberation. That is how the Second World War ended for her. That is a fact that should sit heavy on anyone who studies WWII history or military history. When I say this is forgotten history, I mean that in a very specific way. We have mountains of WWII documentaries about tanks and landings. We have countless books on battles, but the stories of the Oversteegen sisters, of Truus Oversteegen, of Freddie Oversteegen, and of Hannie Schaft are often a paragraph, sometimes a footnote. That is not enough. These were people whose courage changed the balance in their neighborhoods. They shaped Allied operations in small but crucial ways. They deserve more than a footnote, and there is another reason this story matters, especially to men over 60 who have lived through their own hard decades. You know what it means to keep going when the world is uncertain. You know what it means to carry a burden and not make a show of it. Truus Oversteegen carried that burden quietly. She did not brag. She did not look for fame. She wanted her family safe and her country free. That kind of quiet strength is something our generation respects. It is why the Oversteegen sisters are so easy to honor and why we should keep telling their story. Some people ask whether these kinds of actions were justified. They look at Assassination Tactics and ask if it was right. That is a fair question, and I will not pretend it is simple. What I will say is that in World War II, the choice was often between a hard action and a harder consequence. Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen saw collaborators handing lists to the Germans. They saw families disappear. They made a decision that was as grim as it was necessary. That is the kind of decision that does not fit into neat boxes, but it is part of the reality of the Dutch resistance. The Oversteegen sisters were not working in a vacuum. They were part of a larger underground resistance that passed messages, hid fugitives, and created uncertainty for the occupiers. It was a web that stretched across the country. It was connected indirectly to Allied operations and to other resistance movements across Europe. When you step back and look at the map of WWII history, you see how these small groups formed the veins and arteries of the resistance. The work of a bicycle team in Haarlem mattered because it kept the pressure on the occupation from the inside. There is a practical lesson here, too. The bicycle tactic shows the power of the ordinary. It is not always the big weapon that wins. Sometimes it is the everyday tool used with courage and planning. In military history, we often admire new machines and big strategies. But if you study SOE Tactics or the work of W2 secret agents, you see the same principle. Blend in. Use what is normal. Turn it into a weapon. That is exactly what Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen did. Let me say their names again, because names are how we keep history real. Truus Oversteegen, Freddie Oversteegen, the Oversteegen sisters, Hannie Schaft. These were female resistance fighters in the Dutch resistance, part of the underground resistance in World War II. They are not side characters. They are the backbone of this story, and they belong in the front row of WWII history, Second World War study, and any honest historical biography of women in war. In the end, Truus Oversteegen lived into her 90s. She died in 2016. Freddie Oversteegen followed in 2018. They lived long lives, but they carried the war inside them. That is the lasting impact of World War II on ordinary people who did extraordinary things. That is the part of forgotten history that sometimes gets left out. We talk about victory, but we do not always talk about the long years of living with what victory cost. If you have ever carried a memory you could not shake, you understand what that means. I want to leave you with one more image. Picture a quiet street after dusk, a bicycle leaning against a wall, a young woman with a scarf tying her hair back, ready to go. She is not a soldier in uniform, but she is a soldier. She is Truus Oversteegen, heading out on another mission, trying to keep her country alive. That image, that moment, sits at the heart of this story. It is a moment that tells you everything about the Dutch resistance and the underground resistance, and it belongs in the same frame as any battlefield in World War II. If you take anything away from this, let it be this. History is not just a list of generals and dates. It is a collection of choices made by people under pressure. Truus Oversteegen chose to fight. Freddie Oversteegen chose to fight. Hannie Schaft chose to fight. They used bicycles, pistols, and guts. They used assassination tactics and SOE tactics in a way that let ordinary people stand up to a brutal machine. That is the kind of story that should live on, because it reminds us what courage looks like when no one is watching. And so, when you think about the Second World War, remember the Oversteegen sisters and the Dutch resistance. Remember the female resistance fighters who made the world turn a little more slowly for the occupiers. Remember the women who were not in trench coats but on bicycles. Remember the Nazi hunters who did not seek glory, only justice. Remember Hannie Schaft, who paid the highest price. Remember Truus Oversteegen, who carried the memory and kept it alive. That is how we keep this from becoming forgotten history. Thanks for spending this time with me. Keep your eyes open, keep your heart steady, and keep the stories alive. We owe that much to the people who took a bicycle, a pistol, and a steady hand, and pushed back in the darkest days of World War II. Before I sign off, I want to zoom in on the bicycle again, because that simple machine carries the whole story. In the Netherlands of the Second World War, bicycles were everywhere. Fuel was scarce. Roads were crowded. A bicycle could slip through. That is why the Oversteegen sisters used it. Truus Oversteegen could ride out in daylight, park near a checkpoint, and listen. She could ride home with a message tucked under the seat. She could use the same bicycle to lure a target, to escape, to disappear. That is the beauty and the terror of the innocent bicycle tactic. It is ordinary, and it is deadly. That is the kind of detail that matters in WWII history and in military history, because it shows how ordinary tools become the weapons of an underground resistance. There is also a bigger strategic point. The Dutch resistance needed to keep pressure on the occupiers while the big Allied operations moved forward. That meant sabotage, intelligence, and yes, selective killings. It was not random. It was aimed at people who were doing real harm. Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen were careful about targets. Hannie Schaft was careful about targets. They used assassination tactics not as revenge, but as a shield for people who had no other defense. This is why a historical biography of women in war has to deal with the hard parts. It cannot just say they were brave and move on. It has to say what they did and why. Sometimes, when I read about WWII secret agents, the stories feel distant, almost like spy fiction. But the Oversteegen sisters make it plain. They were not cloaked in glamour. They were female fighters in wooden shoes on a damp road, with the smell of wet leaves and canal water around them. They were female resistance fighters who could shift from laughter to silence in a heartbeat. They were Nazi hunters, not because they loved the hunt, but because they could not accept the cruelty they saw. That is a kind of courage that is hard to measure, but easy to respect. If you grew up in a house where World War II was a living memory, you know how the war shaped the people who returned. You know the silence, the no-nonsense way some men carried themselves, the reluctance to talk. Truus Oversteegen carried that same silence. She did not see herself as a hero. She saw herself as a person who did what had to be done. That is a common thread in women in war and in men who served. The most important actions are often the ones that feel too heavy to talk about afterward. There is another angle that matters, and it is the idea of choice. In the Second World War, people were forced into choices they never wanted. The Oversteegen sisters chose the Dutch resistance. They chose the underground resistance. They chose to risk death to protect strangers. That is a series of choices that add up to a life. If you want to understand WWII history, you do not just look at headlines. You look at those choices. You look at Truus Oversteegen making a decision in a kitchen and then riding a bicycle into danger. When you hear the names Truus Oversteegen, Freddie Oversteegen, and Hannie Schaft, I want you to feel the reality of them, not just the legend. These were young women who laughed, who ate bread and cheese, who got cold in the rain, who made mistakes, and who kept going. That is why this is not just a war story. It is a human story. It is a story of the Dutch resistance and its people, and it is a reminder that the underground resistance was made of neighbors, not superheroes. So when the conversation turns to WWII Documentaries or the big sweep of military history, remember to bring these names along. The Oversteegen sisters, Truus Oversteegen and Freddie Oversteegen, and their friend Hannie Schaft, are as much a part of World War II as any general. They are part of the fabric of WWII history, part of the Second World War, in a way that touches the heart and the gut. If you keep their memory alive, you keep the truth alive, and you keep this from slipping into forgotten. History. Thanks again for listening. That is the story of the innocent bicycle tactic and the older sister who made it a weapon. It is a story of female resistance fighters, of WWII secret agents, of SOE tactics used on a Dutch street, and of courage that did not look like courage until it was too late. It is a story of the Dutch resistance and the underground resistance, a story of urban warfare in quiet lanes, a story of women in war whose names deserve to be said out loud. I want to say a word about how we remember these stories, because the way we tell them shapes what people believe about World War II. If all we watch are WWII documentaries about battles, we miss the texture. If all we read is military history about generals, we miss the people. A historical biography of a fighter like Truus Oversteegen fills that gap. It turns WWII history into something you can feel in your gut. It makes the Second World War real again, not just as dates but as choices. That is why I keep calling this forgotten history. The more we repeat it, the less forgotten it becomes. And for women in war, that repetition is a kind of justice. Let me be direct about the tactics, because I know a lot of you like to understand the mechanics. The Oversteegen sisters were WWII secret agents in practice, and they used SOE tactics without the badge. When I say SOE tactics, I mean small teams, careful planning, and fast exits. When I say assassination tactics, I mean precise strikes that removed the worst threats. These were Nazi hunters, and they were Nazi hunters because the Dutch resistance needed them to be. They moved through urban warfare in quiet neighborhoods and used the underground resistance as their shield. They passed information that fed Allied operations, and they used Allied operations timing to choose their moments. That is the real machinery behind the story, and it belongs in military history as much as any battle plan. Now, I also want to bring the focus back to the people because the names matter. Truus Oversteegen is not a symbol only, she is a person. Freddie Oversteegen is not a footnote, she is a person. The Oversteegen sisters were not legends in their own time, they were young women doing a hard job. Hannie Schaft was not a headline, she was a friend, a sister in arms. These were female resistance fighters who lived with fear and kept moving. These were women in war who did not ask for a spotlight, but they deserve one. Truus Oversteegen carried the memory. Freddie Oversteegen carried it too. Hannie Schaft paid the highest price. Those are the names that keep WWII history honest. So when you think about World War II and the Second World War, when you think about WWII history and what it left behind, remember that the Dutch resistance was built on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Remember the underground resistance, the bicycles, the quiet streets. Remember the Oversteegen sisters and their innocent bicycle tactic. Remember the WWII secret agents who never called themselves agents, the female resistance fighters who never asked for praise, and the Nazi hunters who never bragged. If we keep saying their names, we keep this from turning into forgotten history, and we give military history the human heart it needs. Let me underline the tradecraft one more time, because words matter. When I say WWII secret agents, I mean WWII secret agents who had no uniforms. When I say SOE Tactics, I mean SOE Tactics stripped down to nerve, timing, and a bicycle. When I say Assassination Tactics, I mean assassination tactics aimed at the worst offenders, not at the innocent. And when I say Nazi hunters, I mean Nazi hunters who moved through urban warfare with a calm face and a fast exit. That is how the Dutch resistance and the underground resistance made space for Allied operations. It is the kind of detail that military history should highlight and that WWII documentaries too often skip. It is also the heart of any historical biography of female resistance fighters and women in war, and it is exactly why this story refuses to stay forgotten history. All right, that is the full picture. Thank you for giving this story your time and your attention. Keep these names close and keep the memory alive.